Okay, I never thought this would be 4 episodes long on a single song. Hopefully you're into details as much as I am, and that's why we ended up having everything longer. So we're going to dive straight back in and look at the lead vocals to Home to Me. Here is the awesome plug-in chain that I had for Malukah's vocals, and I'm going to let you hear it soloed with all the plugins active.
The dark wood falls before me, with broken bough and blackened leaf. I stand where trees meet with the sky, and in the stillness find you by.
Now yes, there are a lot of plugins on here, and yes, I don't necessarily condone just stacking up plugins to see what they do. This is more about a little bit going a long way. And what we'll do is we'll break down each plugin, what it's adding, and why I chose it. The first thing that I'm going to show is just this Vocal Rider plugin. It's a great little thing that Waves has, and basically you give it a target range, which I've got here, like -3 to +5 or something like that. And I'm keeping the vocal within that sort of target range. And this is after everything else. I've got a bunch of compressors and things. This is at the very end of the signal chain. And it's doing just a little bit. You can see it.
The dark wood falls before me.
Now, Jason, what's the difference between a vocal rider and an actual compressor? I'm really glad that you asked that. The beauty of the vocal rider is it doesn't just go down and compress the volume, it also goes up and expands. So it's basically a compressor and expander built in, one plugin. And that way, if there's the end of a phrase that gets a little bit too quiet, it'll push it up a little bit, only like a couple of dB. And if it gets a little too loud, it'll pull it down a little bit, again, only a couple of dB. And this is after all of the compressors. So really, it's sort of like a final little mix tweak, just to keep the vocal sitting like right in the perfect spot. I'm not a fan of lots of compression, unless I want it as an effect. The general idea with me for compression is transparency and having something sound consistent throughout a song. And that's where the vocal rider is like the icing on the cake, basically. So now that you've seen that, I'm going to get that out of the way, and we can talk about everything else. First, I'm just going to disable all of these, and we'll talk about the reverb, which is this beautiful EMT 140 plate reverb from Universal Audio, which is right here under EMT. And I'm using it as a send expressly for this reason right here. I've got an EQ taking out a pretty good amount of the low end.
The dark wood falls before me.
Just on 2 seconds. Now you can roll off the input filter here, which is great. It's a nice gentle 12 dB slope, which is the exact same thing as this. But I wanted to scoop a little bit of the lower mids out as well. And a lot of times it's just easier for me to see the total EQ on a single thing. And let's face it, you just can't beat FabFilter. So I'm using this as a send from all of her vocals. And as a result, I've got it on 100% wet. That's really all there is to see about the verb. The EQ I can bypass.
The dark wood falls before me.
Turn it on.
The dark wood falls before me.
So it's just cleaning up a tiny bit of the low end. And it's not a matter that I thought the low end needed to be cleaned up. It was more a matter of that low end on the reverb just gets masked by other tracks. So cleaning it up is really just getting rid of what you're not going to be able to hear in the final mix anyway. And if you can't hear it, if it's masked by other things, and with low end, this is very true on pretty much all of your tracks except the ones that you want to have low end. Having a low cut like that and getting rid of those anything from 300 hertz, usually I'd say 80 hertz easily cut from 80 hertz down on anything that you don't have low end energy in. It'll just clean up the mix, especially when you start talking about lots and lots of tracks that, I've had string samples and things that have a lot of rumble in them, especially harmonics and stuff like that that's quiet. You're just getting rid of those extra low frequencies that you just frankly don't need, and more importantly, can't even hear in the final mix. So I'm using this as a send so I can EQ just the reverb. And then I've also got this pulled down almost 6 dB. So here's our send, the EMT. This is the lead vocal. So I've got it set to -3. Now with the background vocals, which we'll get to in a minute, those are all set, these are set to 0, these are set to -3.5, and then the overall reverb's also being pulled down by almost 6 dB. So that's just a matter of a balancing act. And another great thing about having any sort of an effect on a send, you can control the amount of your original channel that's going to the effect, and then you can also control the amount of the effect that's getting pumped back into your mix. So you've got 2 different points of control, and it's sort of like gain staging, where it's just a matter of the specific application you're using, like how much do I want to go to it, how much do I want it to spit back out. And as you can see here, for whatever reason, I found these to be the magic numbers. These are harmony vocals. These are like doubled lead vocals, and I like them a little more wet, and I even have them pulled down more here. We'll get to pre-fader sends in a second. Let's keep focusing on the lead vocal. So that's the reverb. And then I also have the affix, which I would recommend if you're really into learning more about some of these things. I'm just going to touch on real quickly. Go back to the previous episodes because they were covered there as well, and I don't want to do too much duplicate talks about things. So this is a general affix send that I have. And even with the reverb on, if you listen to it on and off, you can tell there's some wonderful sparkle at the top.
But darkwood falls before me. But darkwood falls before me.
It's almost 27 dB down, so it is subtle, but it makes a big difference. Now, just temporarily, I'll give you a couple of phrases without any reverb or the exciter on it.
But darkwood falls before me, with broken bough and blackened leaf.
Okay, come on. That's the raw file that she sent me. I think she was using a blueberry mic, and she has since upgraded to a bottle tube mic, the blue bottle tube mic. We had a lot of discussions about microphones and preamps and stuff when we were doing this. And it was a time where she wanted to upgrade. And for me, the Blue Bottle 2, Stage 2, I think it's called, Blue Bottle Stage 2, is a really, really amazing bottle. Is a really amazing tube mic that has interchangeable capsules on it as well. And I believe she also has a tube preamp now as well, and maybe she was using that on this, a tube preamp with the blueberry mic. And you can hear there's a little bit of low-end kind of build-up on certain words, and ultimately that got cleaned up before we printed the final stems. I don't have it on this because I didn't do it in this program. This is like the almost final version of the stems with just a little bit of tweaking on her lead vocal. And really, that's pretty much it. So there's something to be said, I think, for your source being nice and clean and a good performance. And when you're working with Malukah, you know you're always going to get a good performance because she's just amazing. And if you're watching this, you're amazing. Thank you, Malukah. So just for clarity, I'm going to leave the reverb and the little exciter on there because that's usually how I end up working, especially with a lead vocal. I want to be able to hear kind of into the sound, and I know that that reverb's going to stick, and I know I want that little tiny bit of high end. So then everything else I'm doing, I'm actually doing into those two effects. So I'm sort of monitoring it the way I would be hearing it in the mix. And the reverb, there's not too much of it, and it's not like it's going to be covering up any things that would pop out otherwise if it were bypassed. All right, first point of call was a little bit of EQ, getting rid of some of that bottom end, a little bit of this frequency. Which I don't think I zeroed in, but as you can see, we're 43 cents of an E natural, which is the root of the song. So this is just a matter of a resonant frequency because it's the same key and she's singing a lot of E's. This just helps clean it up just a little bit. And we've got our usual dialogue frequency. And then something a little higher. So here it is without it.
The dark wood falls before me. The dark wood falls before me.
And if you can see, certain syllables and consonants are peaking some of these frequencies. Next, we have the 1176, which does most of the compression on this track. Now I've got it set to the slowest attack and the fastest release, which means hopefully you're getting fairly transparent compression. If it's got a slow attack, it means it's not going to clamp down on it super quickly. It's going to take a little bit of time to kind of pull it down, and then once the volume has dipped down below the threshold again, it releases really, really quickly. This is something that I like to do a lot if I'm looking for transparent compression. And then we'll talk about these other two compressors because it's really a combination of the three. So let's watch the needle.
The dark wood falls before me.
And you can really tell a difference once we get down to the chorus.
Darkness falls across land and black sea.
I'll bypass it.
Darkness falls across land and black sea.
Now it is a little softer when the compression is turned on, and that's on purpose because I'm gain staging going into the other two compressors. I'm going to play this one more time with it on and off and try to listen to the dynamic level of her syllables and keep your eye on the needle when it's turned on, because this isn't about the overall volume level of the vocal, it's about the dynamic level of the vocal, and this is why compression is so vital, especially when you're talking about lead vocals. Darkness falls, she hits that a little bit harder, and the compressor is pulling it back a little bit. And I think if you look at a combination of the needle here and the waveforms here, you can see what the compressor is doing. So this is with it on. Pay attention to where it's clamping down.
Darkness falls across land and black sea.
So pretty obvious. You've got a spot there, a little bit here. Now I'm going to turn it off and listen to how those words poke out without the compressor.
Darkness falls across land and black sea.
So that's what the compressor is doing. Now the next one that I have is almost more for character than anything else. I've talked about this before. This is just an amazing tube compressor. And even if it's not actually doing any compression, it just warms up the sound.
Darkness falls. Darkness falls.
You can see it's moving the tiniest bit, and I have it set just to move the tiniest bit. It's more about running it through this amazing circuitry. Now this last one, which is a classic vocal and bass compressor, the AA22, another beautiful tube compressor. And I imagine that it's doing a little less than the 1176, but it's probably compressing more than the Fairchild. Fairchild's more about personality. These are the two compressors I have paired together to get the maximum kind of vocal compression and still have it be transparent. And that's the key. The 1176 is a classic super fast attack and release ability compressor. That's why it's so great on drums. When you hear that super big smashed, heavy compressed sound for drums, 9 times out of 10 it's an 1176 or something that's basically copying an 1176. Now an LA2A, which is the third one we have in our chain, is a classic, much slower attack and release, plus it's program dependent, and I've talked about this a little bit before, but the beauty of a program dependent compressor like the LA2A is the more you push it, the compression ratio and attack and release all change based on how hard or not as hard you're hitting the compressor. So this little needle that you see down here moving is, this is like the tip of the iceberg really. There's all kinds of things going on in the background because the only two controls you have are how much you want to compress and how much you want the output to be. We'll leave it off for a second.
Darkness falls.
Let's turn it on.
Darkness falls across land and black sea.
And this is the kind of thing. I keep saying subtle, and I really do mean it. Here's without those two compressors.
Darkness falls.
Now I know it's a little louder, and that can be tricky to your ears when you turn the compressors back on. But let me...
Darkness falls.
I know it's louder because I've basically gotten my gain stage straight again, but there's also a difference in the timbre of her voice. It's a little brighter and it's a little creamier, and that's because of these two compressors. And the DBX 160 is another great compressor that adds a little bit of top end to anything that it does, just based on the way that it compresses. And if you think about it, none of these are multi-band compressors. They're technically compressing the entire signal, but the way that their circuits and the inside of the original compressors that these plugins were modeled after, the way those react to different frequencies is completely different from brand to brand, and the type of compressor that you're using, whether it's a FET or... We'll do a whole episode on compressors. But it's really fascinating because you can put, especially with these modeled compressors, 3 or 4 different compressors and have the same settings and go through and bypass and listen to each one individually. And the end result is a different sound depending on the compressor because each one deals with highs and lows differently. They have different response rates. The circuitry inside them is different. That's why I love mixing and matching things like this. We've got a basic de-esser. Of course, it's FabFilter.
Darkness falls across land. Darkness falls.
You can hear it's jumping on those sibilances very, very nicely. One of my favorite EQs. Let's see, what are we doing here? A little bit of gain. Only a couple of dB. So we've got a little taken away at 220 and a little taken away at 4.8. So I'm pulling out even a little more of, a little lower than that, but basically like right around here and right around here with Neve.
Darkness falls. Darkness falls.
Can you hear how it's starting to come together a little bit now? A little bit of extra gain. And I like using that Neve channel strip because you're getting, again, that beautiful Neve sound. Just a little bit of lower mids and upper mids getting scooped out there. And it's all about the additive accumulation of all of these things. Then we've got the vocal rider, which we already talked about. And I will leave it on, but I'm going to hide it so that we can see the micro shift, which is another beautiful Soundtoys plugin. Let me turn this up all the way, and you can hear what it does, and then we'll pull it back.
Darkness falls.
So you hear how it's got that sort of chorusy kind of effect. I've got it pulled back to probably 40%.
Darkness falls. Darkness.
you can hear it's just doing just a little bit of kind of rubbing. And again, this is the sort of thing, it's like it's kind of simulating a double-tracked vocal, which we do have double-tracked vocals in this, but it just, in the mix especially, it gives it just a little bit more edge, kind of like the Aphex Sen that I had. So that's the lead vocal, that's how everything's built up. Now, the other thing that I had, and I requested this of her, and it's funny because she said that she does this anyway. With vocals for lead, with guitars for lead, guitars for rhythm and things, a lot of times I love doubling tracks. And I think she sang the whole song. I got a lead and I got 2 doubles for the lead, and then I got another set of doubles for the harmony tracks. And I sort of pared it down and figured out where I wanted to emphasize what. And a lot of this just comes down to taste and kind of where you want to boost it. Having doublings, especially for lead vocal, does give it a very specific kind of sound. Now again, I've got the doubles going to the EMT plate. And I think literally all I did was just grab this right here and copy it over like that. So I've got the same effects on all 5 of these. Now on the harmony, I have the same Aphex Sens because I wanted the harmony to poke out just a tiny bit. But on the regular doubles, I do not have the Aphex Sens because, if I remember correctly, when I had them turned on, it was a little too much. Didn't need it. Let's see if the micro shift. And I think that's the one thing that I tweaked. So if we look at the micro shift, this is the lead. The detune's at minimum, and the mix is right around there. Here, I've got the mix at 12 o'clock, and the detune's definitely turned up a lot more. So the doubles are literally just that.
Darkness falls.
And here's another one.
Darkness falls.
And that's the big trick with double tracking or triple tracking or quadruple tracking instruments. If you're just going to do 2 double tracks, meaning you've tracked it again twice, have them panned hard, hard left and right panning. Your main track is center, and then you've got hard left and right for the other 2.
Darkness falls. Darkness falls.
So you're getting a much richer kind of sound. Now I've got the EMT Sens. This is the plate, the same one that I've got on our lead vocal. They are pre-fader here, which is this little cute guy right here. These are all pre-fader, meaning when I pull these faders back, I'm reducing the dry level altogether, but I'm not changing the wet level at all. So it's effectively pushing the vocals a little further back in the mix, and the reverb is staying at the same level. This is a great trick when you're trying to balance things like this and get them to work in the mix, to make it sound like they're further back. There's a great video that I will put a link of in the description of Michael Jackson singing the lead vocals to We Are the World. And he's just in the room by himself singing, "We are the world, we are the children." And you hear Quincy Jones. He's doing the lead and he's triple tracking, I think, for basically the same effect that we're doing here. You hear Quincy Jones coming over the speaker. "That's great, Michael. Let's do it again. Take 2 steps back, please." And there's this big microphone, you know, like just in the corner of the camera. And he takes 2 steps back and he sings it again. You hear Quincy, "That's great. 2 more steps back, please." And he takes 2 steps back again and sings the third one. And the idea is they're using the natural acoustic properties of the microphone in the room. With every double-tracked take, he's getting further from the microphone, and it's giving it a completely different sound. And that's one of the things that I asked Malukah to do for this, is for these 2 just to back up off the microphone a little bit. And you're reducing proximity effect, you're reducing the overall dynamic response of the mic, and you're basically getting less of a pronounced emphasis of all those frequencies. And it just naturally helps things to blend better. Let's take a look at the harmony. I do have a little bit of Aphex on there. same send that I have from the main vocal because I wanted the harmony to be able to sit a little more forward in the mix with the main vocal.
All alone, but for stone, sky, and tree.
So it's a one-part harmony, but as you see, I've got it double-tracked with it hard-panned left and right. So if we combine that with the main vocal.
All alone, but for stone, sky, and tree.
Or if you just wanted to hear the double-tracked lead vocal with the harmonies.
All alone, but for stone, sky, and tree.
You can still hear the melody, but it's definitely pushed a little further back. That's because once we add this one,
All alone, but for stone, sky, and tree, I will bring you home to me.
and it looks like I was doing just a little bit of reduction here on this frequency.
All alone, but for stone, sky, and tree.
I've talked about the power of multiband compression and how much I love Pro MB before, but the general idea is what you're getting is a little bit of gain reduction once it passed this specific threshold setting, and it's only going to pull it down. It's set to 6 dB, and it probably doesn't even go that far.
All alone.
Looks like it's bouncing between 0 and 3 dB. Now we can take a look at the accompaniment vocals, which in this case, I've got 3-part harmony, and since I have 3 voices that I pretty much wanted the exact same processing on, I have them running to a group, which is where all of these plugins are sitting. So we'll bypass this, bypass that, and I can play each one of these on their own really quickly. Obviously a little altar boy there. And little altar boy there. So together, the reverb and the affix send. Now this is a very short room reverb, so you're not going to hear a lot of tail. It's more about the space behind the vocals. And just for reference, this is the very beginning, the very first verse.
Falls before me with broken bow.
So the first thing I did was put a little bit of altar boy. I like the idea of making it sound a little thicker more than anything else. Some of it was subtle, some of it not so subtle. Definitely an octave down. So they're all set to an octave down, but the mix knob is what's determining how much of that octave you actually hear. The first one that you heard was almost at 100%. It was way over here. This one's at 50%, so you kind of hear a little bit of both. You hear the original dry signal and the AVB octave signal equally. Same thing there. It's at a 50-50 balance. So there's the difference between the 3. Those are the only things I have on the inserts of the specific channels, because everything else I wanted to have it grouped together. So first we had a nice compressor. Obviously that's with little altar boy engaged. Hey look, another compressor. So this holds true the exact same way I was explaining the previous multiple compressors on Malukah's vocals. I'm doing the same thing here. It's just I don't have the need for a fast attack i.e. the 1176, for these vocals because they're all very round and smooth. So I basically took that out, I put the Fairchild in the first position, so it's handling the bulk of the compression duties, and then the LA2A is just grabbing the leftovers. Some EQ, because it's definitely a muddy mix with those octave lower vocals. But Jason, it sounds like you just took all the low end out of the vocals. Well, technically I did take all the low end out of the vocals, but that doesn't mean that you can't still hear that they're playing an octave lower. The reason I scooped that low end out is you literally couldn't hear it in the mix. It wasn't giving any additional support to the song at all. It was basically just getting things super muddy. So the idea is I scoop it out, you can't even tell it's scooped out in the mix, which is the first indicator that you didn't need to have it there in the first place. Ah, we've seen that before, haven't we? This is doing a little bit of extra gain, some high shelf boost, and then at 4.8, a little more boost, and then a scoop out at 220. Let's listen to it without it. And with it. And I promise you, that was a mix-related choice. The vocals, the background vocals that Alan's singing there weren't coming through enough on the mix to sit with Malukah's vocals and the other instruments that we're playing, so I gave him a boost. And then the piece de resistance is the big fat. Basically, I just picked the largest church sound I could find, and I pulled the reverb time back a little bit. That's a very nice verb. And as far as editing goes, this was one single take all the way across. I edited these out just to clean them up just a little bit because there was just some noise and lip smacking and things like that. Alan was singing very, very close into this microphone, and he was literally right about here. Just a little off access because we didn't want to get any plosives or anything. And I had the preamp turned down pretty low because it was very breathy, was the kind of performance that I was looking for. And it all came down to capturing the mic levels correctly and getting the performance, and then just editing out some of the extra stuff that was amplified because we were recording so close to the mic and he was singing such a breathy kind of part. Here's another section at the break, which I'll play for you with everything. So you can hear that it's just rising up 1, 2, 3, 4 on the scale tones. And I think Alan's vocals and the strings are the only two instruments that are doing it. But Mr. Graves, I heard some notes shifting in pitch slightly and it didn't sound like it was perfect. Exactly. It doesn't sound like it's perfect. And you hear those little changes in timbre, and some notes he pushes a little harder than others. It sounds like live people. Hopefully with the little altar boy doing things an octave lower, it sounds like maybe a 6-person choir singing 3-part harmony, even though it's just kind of fifths with a rising sort of line. The idea is it's not a sampled choir, it's not a sampled vocal, it's a real dude singing. So let's hear how his vocal and her vocal sound together with all the effects turned on.
The dark wood falls before me, with broken bough and blackened leaf. I stand where trees meet with the sky, and in the stillness find you by.
So that's basically the idea behind the vocals. lead, double-tracked lead, double-tracked harmony, and then Alan's part is just this simple 3-part harmony that pops up every now and again. So the other instruments we're going to look at are the instrumental soloists, starting with Kristin, her beautiful, beautiful oboe. Now, I actually went over how I use reverb for soloists when they're recording in a dry environment, like in their home, which is the case for this, for Kristin and Jeff, and me recording here. I went over that in a different video that was reverb and basically my template and how I use reverb a couple of different ways. So I'd suggest going back there to get an idea on how the reverb was being used. And we're going to discuss some of the other things here. So this is the MIDI. So what you were hearing was her live track that she sent me with the effects on it. What you were seeing was the MIDI that I sent to her. Of course, like I've mentioned before, I love my Bricastes, and when I'm doing a song, something special like this that's not a score, I'll use them immediately. A little more affects this time, probably because I wanted it to pop out in the mix a little more. What a beautiful, beautiful oboe. And the astute among you notice that it is panned hard right, and that's because the Bricastes are basically making up the difference. You can hear it not only filling out the stereo spectrum, but also filling out some of those kind of upper mids that the oboe is just naturally lacking. And this is the Hall preset that I always have my third Bricaste defaulted to. No explanation needed there, it's amazing. And then here's some affects, so some top end. And that's really helping her sit in the mix. Looks like an EQ and a compressor, and that's pretty much it. So I'm dipping a little bit of this frequency out. And as you can see, we're really close to E natural, which is not a coincidence. That's the pretty much fundamental resonant area of the oboe when we're playing in this sort of key and around those sort of notes. And then I've got a nice relatively slow release and relatively slow attack from the Manley, which is a beautiful tube compressor. So it's just sort of smoothing out her overall performance. And that's kind of all I had to do. She's such an amazing performer that there was really no need to do anything else to her track. Come on. Amazing. Amazing! Last, but certainly not least, we have Jeff's violins. Here's our violin MIDI. This is what I sent to Jeff. And I'm sure it has a little bit of, just a little bit of controller data, getting quieter at the end, but that's about it. I don't remember what oboe and violin patch I used for these. I imagine it was probably Spitfire. Oh no, for the oboe I know it was Berlin. It was the first oboe from Berlin. And Spitfire solo strings, first violin. So here's our MIDI. And I'll play the audio. Now with Jeff, I've mentioned this in a previous video, how I used 2 different microphones for him. I mailed them to him so that I would have a choice, sonically speaking, of kind of the timbre of his instrument. And a lot of details in the other video about the mic specifics and all that sort of stuff. The important thing is, for this one, I ended up using both at the same time. So I've got the 414 here. And the bee's knees here. Now I'm using M auto align. Here's the 414, here's the bee's knees. A great little plugin that will basically take a look at both of your signals and determine if there's any phase issues or differentiation between the microphones. For example, on this one it inverted it. And it just keeps them in phase and sort of avoids any particular kinds of phasing issues that you may have when you're using multiple microphones on a single source. This would be the same example like left and right overheads for drum kit, or a top and bottom snare drum mic for a drum kit. Multiple microphones on a single source, unless you're a super experienced kind of seasoned recording engineer, which I am not. I like using plugins like this just to make sure that things are working and I'm not having any phase issues. So that's really the only thing I have on these 2 channels, and everything else is going through the solo violin bus. Why don't we do reverb first? So this is pretty much the same setting as with Kristin's oboe, just a little less hall because it's such an upfront violin part. And then a little bit of the affix. Oh, this looks very similar to what we did with Kristin. So we're rolling off the bottom end, which there isn't much of. And this particular frequency right here. And what do you know? Look, that's also very close to E natural. Because again, that's the key that he's playing in, and those are the notes that he's sort of focused on. Fairchild is always a great choice when you're looking to add a little bit of fatness and warmth to something. Let me turn it off. You hear how it smooths out those notes instead of having them jump out, and it doesn't sound unnatural. It's a really, really natural sounding compressor. And we're taming some of this frequency, which is pretty much like the entire telephone frequency. Actually, it's a little higher than that. Telephone's kind of 1 to 3. We're focused on 5 with a nice round scoop going down. So this is without it. This is with it. Now, this is a great example of multiband compression and how it differs from EQ. Because if I had done a scoop like that with EQ, it would have made everything sound a lot more muted and closed in. But since it's a multiband compressor, it's only pulling those frequencies down when those specific frequencies are hitting the threshold. So it's keeping it from getting too bright as it gets louder. And when it gets quieter, it's not attenuating the frequencies at all. It's just a really, really natural way of EQing something. What else do we have? Oh, yeah, this Pultec, man. So there's this great trick that you can do with Pultec EQs. You notice that here's your frequency selector, here and here, for low and high. And then you can either boost the frequency or attenuate it, which is another fancy word for saying pull it down. Now the trick is you can boost and attenuate at the same time. And a lot of times this very specific EQ is used for cleaning up low end because it will boost, let's say, 60 hertz, but then you also attenuate 60 hertz. And they're two different curves and they're two different kinds of EQ basically. And it's boosting it one way, but it's pulling it down or attenuating it a different way. And what you end up with is something that gives you more low end, but also cleans up the low end. And that was kind of the idea that I was going for here. I wanted to attenuate the top end at 10K, but I also wanted to give it a little bit of a boost. So that was at 5, this was at 2. Let me just play. So you can hear where it's pulling it down. So if I split the difference and attenuate halfway, this is very much an example where I'm talking about shades of gray. It's very subtle. And it's one of those things that I promise you when I was mixing that, I was doing it within the mix and just listening how everything was sitting, especially in that top 10K range. But that trick, especially with the Pultec, is a really good one to keep track of. It's used mostly, I think, for low end, but the top end essentially does the same thing. Now the violins are panned straight up here, but they're going into this violin bus and they're panned hard left. And you may remember that the oboe is panned hard right, but they have the exact or close to the same reverb assignments. They're both going to Bricasti 1 and 3 and they have an affix. So if I were to play these without the reverb sends, let me see if I can find a spot. Yeah, right there. This is the classic idea of there are basically two instrumental soloists on the track, and I just pan them hard left and right. So it's sort of a call and response thing. I think that's really the only place where they even overlap a little bit, but I like the idea of the listener picturing a stage and the oboe player is on one side of the stage, the violin player is on the other side of the stage, and they're kind of opposite each other. And then I use the reverbs to bring them both together. The last thing I think is worth mentioning that I honestly meant to do on the very first video and completely forgot about is the tempo track. You can see I've got 3 different tempos from 84 at the very beginning and the first verse to 88 on the second verse, and then the rest of the song is 94 from the first time the chorus comes in to the end. So 84 to 88, it's only 4 beats per minute. Can you really tell the difference? You can feel the difference. And from 84 to 94, from the first verse to the first chorus all the way to the end of the song, you can definitely feel a difference. And that was just something that, well, 94 felt too fast for the beginning, and 84 felt too slow for the first time the verse came in. So those are immediate, quick tempo changes. It's not an idea of feeling like you're speeding up or feeling like it's getting faster. It's more about increasing sort of the intensity of the emotion than it is about being technical and saying 4 beats per minute or anything like that. So I'm going to play this real quick with the click track, which will be horribly unmusical, but you'll get an idea of the tempo.
Darkwood falls before me, with broken bow and blackened leaf.
All right, now we're going to go up.
When all the paths are overgrown, and evening falls with crimson glow.
So you feel it picks up a little bit. And here is the last.
Darkness falls across land and black sea.
Now if you picture that 94 BPM in your head and go back to this, it definitely feels slower. But you don't really notice that it's slower unless you start picking it apart and going back. And I had the tempo changes line up when there were instruments coming in as well. So at the beginning here, it's really just harp, strings, and vocals. When the second verse comes in, that's when we're adding some of the plucked strings. And at the chorus is when we have a lot more accompaniment pop in. That's it. We got through the entire song. It ended up being a little longer than I expected, but hopefully it was informative. As usual, the Cubase file, a MIDI version of the Cubase file, plus all the stems and everything are available on my Patreon site, so go check that out and download everything, and you can take a look and explore everything on your own.